Hello and welcome to Basics for Gamers presents the Basics of Starship Combat Part 7, Captains. In this video we will bring our review of Starship roles to a close with an examination of Captains. The Captain's role aboard a starship is to motivate their crew and demoralize their enemies. In some ways, this is the most versatile of the 5 Starship roles in that the Captain is able to act at the start of any of the phases of combat. But note, just because they can act in any of the phases, they cannot act in all the phases in the same round. They're still limited to just performing one action per turn. So, for example, if the Captain wishes to inspire their engineer, then they're going to act at the start of the engineering phase to provide a buff before the ship's engineer takes their action. And Captains may also be the most roleplay intensive of the 5 different Starship roles. Whereas it may be somewhat acceptable for a gunner to simply state their target and make a roll, Captains should be encouraged to act out what they are saying and doing as part of their actions. In the previous example, the Captain wished to inspire their engineer. So what did they say to give them that extra boost of confidence? What did they do to provide that extra +2 or +4 bonus to that engineer? Likewise, should the Captain wish to intimidate their crew into action, what did that look like? And perhaps more importantly, what's going to be the fallout of such an aggressive tactic after combat ends? I would imagine that in most cases, if a PC is ever the target of intimidation by their Captain, then they're not going to take too kindly to that. And think about when the Captain wishes to taunt or mislead their enemy. The Captain's player probably shouldn't say, I'm using the taunt action and I'm going to apply that to the enemy Captain and then just roll dice. But instead, act it out. Develop a dialogue between that player Captain and the GM, and depending on how well that Captain player role plays their action, I often in my games would award a bonus to that player's skill check to reward that extra role playing. With all of that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at each of the actions that are available to Captains. The first Captain action is called Demand. A Captain can attempt to improve the performance of a single crew member by issuing them a demand. To do so, the Captain makes an Intimidate check, but instead of this check being contested by the target character, it's instead made against a flat DC that is equal to 15 plus 1.5 times that ship's tier. If successful, their blunt encouragement results in a +4 bonus to a specific check. And since the Captain may choose to act in whichever phase they wish, they may use Demand to provide a bonus to an engineer skill check, to a science officer's skill check, or to a gunner's attack roll. They could even use this to provide a bonus to the pilot's check for initiative that round. But note that characters may only receive a bonus from the Demand action once per combat. And there is also another major downside in that, again, this is an Intimidate check. So depending on how it is roleplayed, there may be some additional consequences from players who don't like being pushed around. The opposite of Demand is the Captain's second action, and that's called Encourage. Encourage allows the Captain to apply a +2 bonus to another character's action, effectively performing the aid another action but in Starship combat. To do so, the Captain may either roll the same skill that they are applying the bonus to against a DC of 10, or they can make a diplomacy check against a DC of 15. So for example, if the Captain wishes to encourage an engineer who is performing the Hold It Together action, then the Captain could either roll their engineering skill against DC 10, or if they're not very good at engineering, they could instead choose to roll diplomacy against a DC 15. If they are successful, then the ship's engineer is going to receive that +2 bonus to their engineering skill check for Hold It Together. And if the Captain wishes to encourage someone who's making a check that is not a skill check, they would only have one option, and that is making a DC 15 diplomacy check. For example, if the captain wishes to encourage their gunner to take careful aim, in this case, the captain would have to roll diplomacy versus DC 15. They would not be allowed to make an attack roll versus DC 10, as Encourage specifically says to use the same skill against DC 10 or diplomacy against DC 15, and an attack roll, a gunnery check, is not a skill. The third action at the captain's disposal is taunting. Here the captain uses the ship's communication system to broadcast a taunting message to an enemy ship. This is a push action and therefore may not be attempted if either the captain's communication system or the enemy's communication system is malfunctioning or wrecked. Taunting can be done during any phase and requires a bluff or intimidate check against a DC that is equal to 15 plus 1.5 times the enemy ship's tier. If successful, then each enemy character aboard that target ship suffers a -2 penalty to all of their checks on that phase, and that penalty is increased from a -2 to a -4 if the taunted enemy is attempting a push action of their own. Once this is used, regardless of if it is successful or a complete failure, then the enemy ship may not be taunted again in the same combat. So it can only be used once, and it affects only rolls of that phase. However, it does persist for 1d4 rounds. So if it is successful, you roll 1d4, and for that number of rounds, then the enemy actions during that phase only is subject to a -2 or -4 penalty to all of their actions. So, for example, if the captain taunted an enemy during the gunnery phase and rolled a 3 on the 1d4, then for the next 3 gunnery phases, all attacks by that enemy ship are going to suffer a -2 penalty unless that gunner is attempting a push action, in which case it worsens to a -4 penalty. So those are the 3 standard captain actions that are available at first level, but captains gain the ability to issue orders when they reach 6th level. By using the orders action, a captain may grant a second action to one of their crew members. Doing so costs one of the captain's resolve points and requires them to roll a check at the beginning of the phase in which the targeted crew member is going to act. The type of check required depends on the role of the crew member they wish to grant an extra action to. Captains roll a computers check to grant an extra action to their science officer. They roll engineering to grant a second action to an engineer. They roll a gunnery check for gunners and a piloting check for the pilot. The DC for this check is 15 plus 1.5 times the ship's tier. If successful, the targeted crew member then gets to take 2 actions that round, but they must be different actions. The targeted crew member who can take 2 actions may not choose to take the exact same action twice. And the last captain action is called Moving Speech. Starting at 12th level, a captain may spend 1 resolve point and then attempt a diplomacy check against a DC equal to 20 plus 1.5 times their ship's tier. But if successful, then all allies for the remainder of that phase, not the entire round of combat, but just that phase, gets to roll all of their checks twice and take the higher of the 2 results for all of their actions in that phase. Just like with every other role, there is a primary system associated with captains, and that is life support. And also like the other roles, when life support becomes damaged through critical hits, all skill checks made for captain actions will suffer a penalty. But, unlike with sensors, engines, power cores, and weapons, there are no real stats or mechanics for a ship's life support system. What little information that is available does tell us that ships have backup batteries that allow life support to function for 2d6 days after the power core is wrecked. But beyond that, the term life support is fairly undefined by the rulebook and is open for each GM to interpret. For example, Eoxians do not need to breathe, and at least one Eoxian starship mentions that it does not have life support on most of its decks. So that raises the question, what happens when that ship or any Eoxian ship without life support suffers a critical damage effect that results in damage to life support? Well, I haven't seen any official rules addressing this, so it's probably going to be up to each GM to decide what happens when a ship with no life support suffers critical damage to the life support system. This has been discussed online a fair bit, and the first school of thought is to treat it as if the ship's life support system was wrecked, in which case all additional critical damage would be applied to the ship's sensors instead. But in that case, there are no conditions that would impose a penalty to the captain for having disabled, wrecked, malfunctioning, or glitched life support. Now, the second school of thought, which I will mention is the one that I subscribe to for whatever it's worth, is that the term, quote, life support is much more broad than just oxygen and atmosphere for a crew to breathe. As far as the game mechanics are concerned, it's just a really simple way of saying all of the stuff that the captain uses to do their job, or all of the equipment and conditions that allow a captain's orders to be carried out. And by that interpretation, life support is breathable air, it is heat, it's artificial gravity, radiation shielding, ship-wide communications, and more. And even Eoxians who don't need to breathe will need some of those items to function, especially communication systems. So my advice to GMs is when a ship takes critical damage to life support, don't just say, your life support is glitching so you take a -2 penalty, but provide a narrative explanation as well. For example, let's say the captain on the bridge wishes to take the encourage action and provide a bonus to their engineer who is 3 decks below in engineering. If the quote life support is undamaged, then there's no penalty and no problem. If the life support is glitching, then tell the player that the ship's internal comm system is suffering from bursts of static and the engineer is having difficulty hearing them. And that explains that -2 penalty to the engineer skill checks. If life support is malfunctioning, you could say a pipe full of coolant has burst in engineering and it's difficult for the engineer to focus on the captain while managing that crisis too. Now, that's all just a narrative description, of course. I wouldn't actually force the engineer to spend their action managing a ruptured pipe. Is just a narrative explanation as to why the captain is facing a -4 penalty to their check, and it just goes beyond simply saying life support is malfunctioning, because the term life support can be a little nebulous to players, and it helps to kind of root that in a narrative explanation. In this video, we discussed the captain role in Starship combat. Captains are responsible for supporting their crews and imposing penalties on their enemies. They may act at the start of any phase of combat before any other roles declare their actions, but are still limited to only taking one action per turn. The phase in which they act will depend on who it is they are attempting to buff or debuff. The first action available to captains is Demand. This requires the player to roll an Intimidate check, and if successful, it grants a +4 bonus to another crew member's skill check. Also note that Demand can only be used to grant a bonus to a specific character once per combat, and remember the role-playing consequences as well. Characters tend to not like being intimidated. The second captain action is called Encourage. This functions in a similar fashion to Demand, except the captain rolls either a diplomacy check or the same skill that the benefiting player is attempting to use, instead of Intimidate. And it only provides a +2 bonus instead of the +4 bonus you get from Demand, but an upside to using Encourage is that it may be used any number of times and should not result in the kind of role-playing consequences you face with Demand. This is essentially the captain performing Aid Another. The third action at the captain's disposal is taunting. Here the captain imposes a penalty to the enemy skill checks by rolling bluff or intimidate. If successful, each enemy character aboard the target ship suffers a -2 penalty to all of their skill checks for that specific phase, and this persists for the next 1d4 rounds. This penalty also increases to -4 if the taunted enemy is attempting a push action of their own. Once used, regardless of success or failure, and also regardless of the phase in which taunt is used, the enemy ship may not be taunted again in that same combat. The next action available to captains is issuing orders. This allows 6th level captains to grant a second action to any one of their crew members that phase, but it must be a different action. A player who benefits from a captain's orders may not perform the same action twice. This costs 1 resolve point, and the type of check required depends on the role of the crew member they wish to grant an extra action to. Captains roll a computer's check to grant an extra action to the science officer, engineering for engineers, gunnery checks for gunners, and they roll piloting to grant an extra action to their ship's pilot. And the last captain action is called moving speech. Starting at 12th level, a captain may spend 1 resolve point and attempt a diplomacy check, but if successful, all allies for the remainder of that phase roll all of their checks twice and take the higher of the 2 results. And just like with other Starship roles, captains do have a primary system that modifies all of their actions and skill checks, and that is life support. When the ship's life support suffers critical damage, a penalty is imposed on the captain's rolls. With that, we'll bring this video to a close. If you found this video helpful, please give us a like, and don't forget to click that subscribe button and bell so you don't miss out on our future videos. Leave us a comment letting us know what topics you would like to see us cover in the future, and we can always be reached through our Twitter and Facebook pages too. If you would like to use some of the maps that we feature in our videos with your own games, you can find them at Maps of Mastery and 0 Hour. Links to those sites may be found in the description. Thanks for watching, take care, and we'll see you soon with more basics for your favorite tabletop games.